Today I want to talk about the wildfires that have been blanketing Canada as well as the American Northeast. I was actually going to do this video, or I was thinking of doing this video last week when New York City was just completely orange, but if you ever walked and talked with an N95 mask on, which is, if you were outside, you should have been wearing an N95 at that time, it gets really difficult, so I decided against it. And I want to talk about all this specifically in reference to a conversation that I had with the climate activist Arnold Schroeder, who runs the Fight Like an Animal podcast. This was artifact number 40, Limits to Growth. And we discussed the 1972 text, Limits to Growth, that basically predicted various scenarios of planetary collapse based on different kinds of inputs, whether it's food production, the depleting of resources. Some of the predictions turn out not to be correct, but the kind of basis for the argument of there are, in fact, planetary limits, that argument obviously has merit. One thing in the book that kept coming up again and again is the 2020s, or 2020 as a kind of turning point. And if you guys recall, around 2018, that's when we had really kind of like the first wave, I guess, of truly record-setting wildfires in California. I remember somebody that I know took a trip out to California around that time and almost got stuck in a national park because the flames were just totally out of control and it was difficult to see even while driving. And this kind of thing obviously is going to be happening more and more as time goes on. As climate change accelerates, nobody's actually really doing anything about it. And even if you do try to do something about it, specific instantiations of climate change, such as wildfires that grow increasingly out of control, they're not that easy to resolve, are they? Right? There is no obvious, clear solution or set of steps that you could take where there's a true mitigation. You're obviously going to get some limited form of mitigation through various containment strategies, but wildfires in general are going to get worse. In fact, I was reading this one study. It was released sometime in the last few months, I believe. I'm going to link it in the show notes and the pinned comment if you guys want to check it out. But basically, they were making various predictions as far as what wildfires might look like going forward, right? With 2 degrees of warming versus 4 degrees of warming. And one thing that's kind of alarming, first of all, is just the kind of nonchalant way that they presented the 4 degrees Celsius warming scenario as something that's just going to happen, which should alarm anybody, right? Because we were talking about 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming as the cutoff point. But now it seems as if people are making peace with the idea of the possibility of 4 degrees of warming. And without even considering some of these, let's just call them for the sake of argument, outlier scenarios, they basically ran the numbers and they estimated that it was something along the lines of 340,000 people every single year from 1997 to 2006 have died indirectly. And perhaps there are some direct numbers there, but those are very small, obviously. Indirectly, we had 340,000 people per year die due to wildfires. Because if you start inhaling smoke, right, even if it's just very far away, the particulate matter that travels to you, if you breathe it in, it's going to cause a long-term problem, right? In the same way that we have things like sudden death syndrome with firefighters, right? They maybe are never singed by a fire, but simply by breathing it in routinely, you start developing complications when it comes to the heart and other bodily systems, lungs. We have this low-grade scenario that's ongoing due to wildfires. And this was, again, keep in mind, from 1997 through 2006. Remember then, we couldn't quite feel climate change back then, right? If the 2020s are supposed to be a turning point in the limits to growth, back then, it was not something that we would very casually feel. We might speculate about it, right? There's data at the time. People were discussing climate change in some of the terms that we're discussing it now. But for the most part, I think the 1990s were kind of considered, first of all, as a win against the models and the limits to growth, as well as the idea that, a lot of this is just sort of going to be behind us. So the 1990s as a kind of illusion, politically, financially, culturally, extends to climate change, climate science as well. And even then, 340,000 people per year, it's a pretty substantial number, right? Especially since we make big deals about things like gun violence and street crime, which obviously, I mean, they're problems, but they come nowhere near the kind of mass death that occurs from everything due to the way that people consume food, habits that are both kind of trained on you, as well as, habits that people just sort of casually pick up. Right, all these things taken together are much more fatal, right, to baseline human experience. I'm sure if you start tallying up the numbers from 2018 through now, we probably have surpassed, right, 340,000 per year. If we start assuming 2 degrees of warming, 3 degrees of warming, 4 degrees of warming, we're supposed to have a increase, according to the study, about like between 30 to 50%. Both in terms of the severity as well as the kind of, gross, acreage. All right, we're going to start multiplying 340,000 by a factor of 3, by a factor of 5. If the kind of chaotic nature of climate change accelerates, right, where we have all these feedback loops that are kind of unknown, we might very well easily be in a situation where we have to multiply by an order of magnitude, right, where we have essentially millions of people dying due to this kind of like slow strangulation. So those are some of the practical ramifications day to day, right? Things that were invisible back in the day, they're going to be accelerating and becoming more and more visible now. My guess is a lot of the stuff that used to be said about, climate change isn't real, right? That was the original claim. Now it's climate change is real, but it's not man-made. Now what reactionaries are flirting with is, there are these right-wing talking points along the lines of climate change is real and it's man-made, but there's nothing that we could actually do about it, or the costs of it are too high, right, for me to personally, take upon myself to do X, Y, and Z. So therefore, you might as well just live as if nothing is happening. Another aspect to all this, and I remember getting into an argument with a more, let's call him a right-wing friend of mine, where I was basically making the claim that, look, we already have had millions of climate change refugees, right? If you take something like the, the 2004, or was it 2009 tsunami in India, which killed something like 100,000 people, displaced millions. Even if you want to make the argument that, look, that's not all climate change, right? These are just also natural elements that ebb and flow, right, on our planet. This might be true, but whatever percentage you want to ascribe to it, right? It could be as low as 25%. It could be 50%. It could be 75%, right? Eventually, you're going to take 25 or 50 or 75% of these numbers, and you're going to get millions and millions of refugees, right, that are being made. And even with these evacuations, right, with this specific wildfire in Canada, this affected multiple provinces, but I guess more recently, I mean, they've been having wildfires kind of like on and off throughout the year so far, but recently this was in Quebec. Something like 100,000 people were evacuated, right? I mean, to some degree, right, that is also an example of climate refugees, right, in the developed world. When Hurricane Katrina came, if you want to ascribe 25% of that to climate change or whatever other number, the fact is the kind of massive displacement that we had, the city is in tatters, right? It has not been properly dealt with. It was not properly rebuilt. This is what people are dealing with right now, right? In the developed world, this is coming closer and closer to us. And one argument that Limits to Growth makes that I haven't really thought about prior to reading the book is when we start experiencing more and more climate damage, and they don't specifically discuss the climate, but I guess any modern iterations of the book would. But as climate change accelerates, more and more resources have to be funneled into the mitigation specifically of those effects, right? So for instance, how do you deal with wildfires? How do you deal with flooding? How do you deal with excess death? All these things have to be dealt with in some way. And this takes money, right? This takes time, this takes energy, this takes human capital. It takes all of that. And as that's happening, less and less money is available for everything else. In this way, when you look at some of the graphs in that book, you could definitely understand how even in the more kind of optimistic scenario where we have a sudden dump in quality of life, standard of living, and human development, and lifespan, all of that, even if we have a sudden dump that lasts for, it could be a decade, it could be several decades, before we sort of resume this planetary trajectory of, ever higher human development. Because when you look at some of the ramifications specifically right now of these Canadian wildfires in Alberta, which also was experiencing and is experiencing wildfires right now. Alberta, of course, is a province in Canada that produces lots of oil. During these wildfires, oil production had to be shut down, right, for safety reasons. The effect of that was a sudden spike in oil prices, right? In the same way that back in coronavirus, right, we had the opposite. Fewer people using things like cars, aviation, right? Oil prices drop. Here it's the opposite. Here we have a constriction of supply. You can imagine this sort of thing happening more and more, and it doesn't have to be necessarily with oil, right? It could be any kind of resource, things that you're used to, right? Whether it's like leisure or whether it's, actual things that you need, such as fuel, all that becomes less accessible. Now, to get back to the idea of 2020s and the limits to growth, we've already experienced a kind of de-development, at least when it comes to human lifespan, because we have not returned to pre-pandemic lifespan. And this has a couple of factors. First of all, there's just the kind of excess death when it comes to coronavirus. It's not that other causes of death that used to be like number 3 or number 5 or number 10 were displaced, right? They were displaced numerically, but they still exist. And quite suddenly, kind of out of the blue, we suddenly received a new set of causes of death, right? Which is coronavirus. Back then it was directly, and now what we're getting is this slow kind of attrition, where if you start looking at the kind of studies that were coming out starting in early 2022, newer studies right now for people who are vaccinated, they show multiple infections are not good for you. Even a single coronavirus infection is not the same thing as catching a cold. It's not the same thing as having a flu. It's not the same thing as what essentially back in 2020, right? Republicans were saying things like, oh, don't worry about it, it's just a little cold. Democrats right now are saying, don't worry about it, it's just a little cold, right? Verbatim, actually, a hardcore Democrat that I know who was very, total COVID geek back in 2020 is now essentially just telling me, don't worry about it, it's just a little cold. And it's not, right? Again, the studies are pretty unequivocal on this. It's much, much better for your health to have 0 infections than 1. And 1 infection is certainly better for your health than 2, 3, 4 infections and more. This kind of slow attrition, it's kind of fascinating that limits to growth didn't quite specify what it would look like. And some of the specifics turn out to be wrong. But the general trend line, the idea of some sort of planetary limit, some set of encumbrances that you're not going to just so easily shake off. All of that is just essentially playing out. So I think it's just very important to not view climate change and not view these like wildfires and whatnot necessarily in the kind of apocalyptic scenarios and apocalyptic images that, like, if you, like, for instance, like, remember many movies in the 90s, they were based on apocalypse sort of scenarios, right? It was all kind of geared towards flooding, right? Death by aliens, death by meteors, right? Just death in the most kind of extreme way imaginable. And that's not a very useful lens, because what this actually looks like practically is we have little by little, right, all these cuts that are emerging, and you're not even going to notice it. If New York City is slated to be underwater, or large portions of it, something like a quarter to a third underwater, let's say by 2100 to maybe the first few decades of the 2100s, it's not going to come all at once where you wake up one day and suddenly the water is at your feet, at your knee. What's going to happen is there's going to be a very bad storm at some point, and the house that you were living in that maybe at some point was storm proof, now it's flooded, right? Now it's damaged to the point where you either have to spend a lot of money on repairing the damages, or you just totally have to move out. Maybe you're able to be lucky and you have flood protections and you're able to either repair it or to just totally move out, find a new home. In that case, you're lucky. But at the same time, remember what I said about what's going on with resources and how they're going to be funneled to other forms of mitigation and not just human development. Right now, if you look at California and you look at Florida, insurance companies are just totally pulling out of these states because it's becoming just too difficult to be able to cover the costs for them. And the state is not stepping in to necessarily cover the costs either. And even if you do have insurance and they're not pulling out, I mean, like, honestly, if you've ever, lived in a house and had to do your own repairs and stuff, and if you have insurance, they will always just try to do everything they can to not cover what needs to be covered. So ultimately what ends up happening is you personally, you have to bear that cost. No one is going to come out to bail you out, right? The bailouts, as they're happening, if there is, for example, issues in the economy and these kinds of bailouts are happening, there's going to be a kind of distinction, right, between the period where governments are totally uncomfortable with any kind of bailout, right, which is kind of the defining quality, I think, to the Obama administration. But although the COVID response overall was better, it still is going to be totally insufficient compared to what's coming. I mean, even just kind of like the basic numbers of stuff like, all right, we need to, update our infrastructure in the United States, right? The price tag for that is somewhere between $4 to $5 trillion, right? Compare that to like Biden spent something like 1/10 of what he needed to just for that, right? And that's only going to balloon, and eventually, right, it's just going to kind of cycle out of control if it's not tackled appropriately. So eventually spending is going to have to increase, and it's going to especially increase because under whatever regimes the global south is under, they're gonna make the point that, look, you guys brought about this problem, but you guys, for whatever reason, you're able to spend however you want to spend. It doesn't necessarily have that really powerful negative fiscal impact, right? Because there's some countries, although like MMT declares that if you print your own currency and you kind of hold your own debt, doesn't ideally shouldn't really matter. But the fact is, a country like Russia, which prints its own currency for the longest time, it has just kept a very sort of strict austerity. But eventually we can't have regimes of austerity, because if climate refugees truly do become this recurring phenomenon, and we have a kind of essentially a global insurrection right from the south to the north, because eventually everybody's going to want to live in the American Northeast and Canada or Russia, right? The only way to really avoid that is you have to placate them, right? You're going to have the sort of allowances that we have enjoyed for such a long time. We will be operating under a totally different set of assumptions. And I mean, I'm looking forward to a totally new set of assumptions. But again, I'm just not, I'm not so sure that we get there without a substantial dump in the standard of living for pretty much everybody across the board. So again, keep in mind what I said, things are getting more and more competitive, right? There was a time when you could have just thought, I want to go live in California, right? If you had the money and the means to do so, that at a certain point was highly, highly desirable. But wouldn't you now look at it and say, well, I don't know how tenable that is, right? I don't know how long I could spend time there before, I'm no longer able to keep insurance on my house, for instance, right? And it's kind of funny because when you look at maybe the public statements of somebody like Ron DeSantis, maybe he's going to pay lip service to climate change being bullshit, but he doesn't act like it, right? When it comes to actual, sort of fiscal programs in Florida, because Florida is actually going through it, right? Florida is actually one of the states that is most susceptible to climate change, and as that's happening, right, he understands that he can't allow Florida to essentially disappear, right? And so he's going to spend. If Florida becomes unlivable, right, if much of the U.S. becomes unlivable, there's not that many places left for you, right? There's Pittsburgh. You could get still good houses in Pittsburgh between $250,000 to $500,000, which, you know, it sounds like a lot, especially by the standards of, let's say, 20 years ago. But it's better than many other locations that are kind of, you know, priced right now as if climate change is not actually occurring. Anyway, I don't have too much else to say here. I actually have my first video essay that I've been working on that should be up in the next couple of days or so. So looking forward to that. It's going to be based on the White Fragility book by Robin DiAngelo. I'm actually going to be doing an artifact show on these topics sometime a month from now. So I'm trying to get some of the thoughts out of the way first, turn it into a video essay, see what that looks like, see what I'm able to do, and kind of, you know, push myself as a video editor as well. So thank you for watching. Like, subscribe. I will see you guys soon.